to this, congratulations. As of this moment, we are both still alive, and that alone is something to be grateful for. Well, I might be dead, but chances are that you're still alive. If it's your first time listening, we're stoked to have you, and if it's not, then welcome back to the Don't Panic, We're All Going to Die podcast. I'm your host, Johnny Nava, and today we have a very special guest. Jessica Cale is an author, editor, and a historian that you may have seen on Netflix's Lost Pirate Kingdom. On her podcast, Dirty Sexy History, she aims to focus on the aspects of history that are not sanitized for a modern audience. If you're interested in sex, and particularly the history of sex, then I highly recommend it because it's dirty, it's sexy, and it actually happened. And just to warn you, this episode would probably be rated PG-13 or R because of its sexual content. But we don't just talk about sex. We get into history, how it affects the way we view ourselves, and then we spend a good amount of time talking about how to best utilize the time we have here on Earth. So I think you're going to enjoy it. Last thing, this episode is definitely the most sexy, but it's also definitely the most political conversation I've had on here. But I think that's actually a great thing. I'm of the opinion that some of the political realities of life, and specifically American life, are not fair, and that pretending that they don't exist or that they don't affect the mental well-being of the population would be hypocritical, so we're not going to do that here. So, with all that out of the way, I hope you enjoy the episode, and as always, don't panic. Well, Jessica, I am so excited to have you here. You are truly a Renaissance woman. There's so many places that we could start, but perhaps the best place to start would be just with you and your name, and then maybe you could just tell us how you get started in researching sex, the history of sex, and specifically dirty, sexy history.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's kind of a long story, I'm afraid. So, my name is Jessica Cale, and I'm the host of the podcast Dirty Sexy History. I also run the blog Dirty Sexy History, and I do TV shows sometimes. So, I was one of the historians that they talked to on the Netflix show Lost Pirate Kingdom, which is where most people know me from now. Before that, though, I was also a historical romance author. Now, I grew up in Minnesota, and my mission in life was always to be like a historical romance author. When I was younger, I used to just like eat these books up. I absolutely loved them. And the thing that used to drive me crazy though is, people would write about sex in kind of a historic context, but like they would never mention contraception. So I became like obsessed with historical contraception because I knew it had to have existed. People always said it didn't, but I knew it had to. So that kind of became one of my research interests. I started writing, at a pretty young age, because I love to read so much. But what really kicked it off for me was, well, one, when I was younger, I had pretty severe depression, and writing was actually what pulled me out of it. I was very young. I mean, maybe like 11 or 12, and I had really, really terrible depression. A lot of things were going on in my life. My mom had been in a terrible car accident. She survived, fortunately, but things were not very good there for a few years. So what the only thing that really kind of got me through it was writing. My grandma gave me this old typewriter, and I'd write stories every day. And I'm sure they were terrible, but it was good. It was kind of like healthy escapism. But what really kicked that writing into high gear for me in high school, when I was 17, I was actually diagnosed with a brain aneurysm. I was having these terrible migraines, and I had to go into the hospital and get all these MRIs. And it was really scary, that kind of news out of nowhere. I mean, it completely changes your life. So I went from being like a completely normal sophomore in high school to all of a sudden feeling like there was this bomb in my head that was about to go off. Like every day after that, I I would kind of wake up and go like, is this the day I'm going to die? It was pretty intense. So you start to think about your own mortality a lot, and you think about what you want to do in life and what's important to you. And the answer for me from a very young age, it was always, well, I'd better write faster, you know. So I was still wanted to write these stories, and I thought like if I only had one day left on Earth, I would spend it trying to finish my first book. So I ended up taking, well, some chances that a lot of other people didn't. For example, I actually ended up going to college in Europe. I went to school over in the UK studying history because, I always wanted to write those historic novels and I wanted to make sure that they were as good as they could possibly be. So I went and I did a history degree in the UK. I moved over there not knowing anybody. And it was quite a gamble, but it was the best decision I've ever made in my life. I had such a great time. So of course, after that, I did an MFA in creative writing because it was all about the writing.
Hmm.
And then I started, actually getting my books published. So I did publish a couple books before I was 30, and I was pretty proud of that. And this actually leads into dirty, sexy history in kind of an interesting way. So, as I was getting more into the kind of historical fiction, historical romance community, I was finding out more and more that people have all of these misconceptions about sex and history, and especially contraception. It comes back around to that kind of obsession of mine.
Hmm.
So, people would think that it didn't exist, or, that different types of sexualities didn't exist, or different sexual identities didn't exist, all these different things. So, I knew that it couldn't be as simple as that. And I knew from a lot of my research that, of course, the truth was usually more complicated. So I started Dirty Sexy History as a response to that. I really wanted it to be a blog where I could share my own research, especially about sex, but about other things too, and almost kind of like show my receipts for the things that I was putting in my books. My
Hmm.
first book deals with condom use, and people would say, "Oh, well, that didn't exist," and I'd say, "Actually, yes, it did." So, you don't want to
Hmm.
like shout people down on the street. You want to have like kind of a reasoned argument with sources, right? So that's what I did. And Dirty Sexy History started about 6 years ago, and fortunately, I mean, it's been very popular, and that's really kind of taken over. So now, of course, it's a podcast, and I'm really enjoying doing that, and I'm completely blown over by the response. I think it's been really fantastic. So it's been kind of a strange path to get here, a little manic, but but we got there in the end.
Right. Well, I've certainly been enjoying it, and I listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot of it for research purposes, because I like to see what other people do. But I have to say, you probably have my favorite voice out of all the podcasts I listen to. It makes
Oh my
listening to
God.
Dirty Sexy History so soothing because it's just like so smooth, and I'm learning about all these cool things in history. But hearing it in your voice, I don't know, it's much better than hearing about these things in a history class for sure.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much. That means the world to me.
So on that note, talking about dirty, sexy history, I know that one of your goals was to try and focus on aspects of history that aren't sanitized by a modern audience.
Mhm.
Would you mind expanding on what you mean by not sanitized?
Oh yeah, absolutely. When I'm talking about that, it's not even just kind of like cleaning it up, kind of for kids or whatever. At the moment, you're finding more and more that people are like weaponizing history or like weaponizing like nostalgia. So they're using history to, kind of apply it to the modern world and try to make people feel like there's something wrong with them, try to make them feel like they're deviant. Like
Hmm.
people in the past never did that. People never had sex before they got married. People never swore and they always went to church. And it's nonsense. So for me, it's very much about, setting the record straight. I want people now to realize that they might give you this sanitized ideal of the past to try to make you feel bad about living in the present, but it was never like that. I want people to feel like they're less alone. Their ancestors weren't perfect. They were doing all kinds of crazy things. They probably think we were boring comparatively.
Right. I love that. That's really fun, especially we're both from the United States, so we get kind of like this Anglo-Saxon kind of Puritan narrative
Oh
of
yes.
history. So it's very
Hmm.
interesting to see even these people that we consider to be the original Anglo-Saxons. They're even crazier than we were.
Oh my gosh, so much crazier. They get up to all kinds of different things. And people, the version of history that we have inherited, I should say. It's a very Victorian, very sanitized ideal of the history. And that's when this really started. So before the Victorian era, people were under no illusion, about their
Mhm.
relatives, about their parents. This is really the time where people started to say, like, okay, there's this nuclear family, everyone must behave, and it's all about trying to fit in or trying to prove that they're, like better than other people, basically. But even before that, like you think like the Regency period, the Georgians before that, I mean, sex was crazy. Everybody was having affairs. People who were in lower classes, they had sex before, during, after, outside of marriage. I mean, free love was actually an early 19th century concept, and people don't realize that. Birth control has been used since the beginning of time. Like these people saying that, for example, we shouldn't have the right to abortion because it never existed. Well, that's definitely nonsense. And that's one of my things that I'm very passionate about. And I know it's a sensitive subject for a lot of people, but what's interesting to me is that abortion was actually only outlawed by the church in 1869. And before that, it just wasn't anybody's business, and it definitely happened. So that's just one example of the way that people try to use history to make you feel bad, or to say, like, oh, well, there was never a precedent for this, so this must be deviant in some way. Or the idea that people were never gay, or that trans people never existed. It's crap.
Right. I think one thing I heard mentioned on one of your podcasts was that Americans are perverts in private. I like that a lot because it's exactly like you said. Like there's all these things that we think of as being new when really
Mm-hmm.
they're as old as humans are. I remember there's one post that you did I thought was particularly fascinating about Mesopotamia, and you talked
Mm-hmm.
about them. I think they had like transgender priests, and what I thought was so fascinating about that is that Mesopotamia, as far as I know, is like the first civilization. I mean, you're the historian, so I'll defer to your expertise there. But maybe you could expand on that a little bit because I think your listeners would be interested.
Oh, I'd love to. That's actually one of my favorite subjects. That's right. Mesopotamia and ancient Sumer, it is the first known civilization. People argue whether, Egypt might have been a little bit older, but, they generally consider Mesopotamia to be the oldest. So, they had a pantheon of gods. They had all these different gods. And one of them was the goddess Inanna. Now, Inanna had a lot of, kind of fantastic superpowers. She was an absolutely incredible goddess. And in addition to being the goddess of things like love and war, like Ishtar in later years, she also had the ability to change people's gender. So people who wanted to be the other gender, or I suppose their true one, they would go to the temple and they would pray to the goddess, and she would transform them into male or female as they wanted. Now, she had a very specific sect of priests. And these were actually transgender people who worked in the temple and who served the goddess. And they had a lot of different tasks. Most importantly, they were kind of in charge of the music. They had these kind of sacred hymns that they would sing, and they were, very well regarded by the community, and they were considered sacred. And the other mother goddesses that kind of came out of the tradition of Inanna, you have Ishtar, you eventually have Cybele, and even Aphrodite in later years. They would often have these sects of transgender priests. Very specifically, Cybele had an absolutely enormous cult that actually survived throughout ancient Rome, and into the Common Era. So Cybele also had these priests, and they were also in charge of the music, like they had been before, and they were also in charge of some other really interesting things. Like they would help the poor by raising money through fortune telling, or
Mm-hmm.
dancing in the streets or playing music. And they even had these special parades where they would go through the town making this crazy noise with all of these instruments. You could almost think of it like going to a really loud concert now, or like a metal show or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And they would bang the drums and play all these instruments, and they'd shout and they'd sing. And it was incredibly cathartic. Like the village would go and they'd all make this noise, and then they'd feel so much better at the end of the day. And that was one of their kind of sacred duties. And I thought that was so interesting. And these were a lot of people, and they were valued in the community. And people definitely thought they were a little bit strange, but they were so common, you wouldn't think twice about it. Now, the only reason that people don't know about that as much, which I find very interesting, is that a lot of this information was buried around the time that Christianity was taking off, because the cult of Cybele was actually their biggest competitor. So early Christians and the followers of Cybele would actually fight in the street. So this is kind of where that kind of early transphobia really came from. And of course, like there were still issues before that, but that's really kind of when it took off. But before that, these different transgender people, they were valued members of the community, and they were considered sacred. And I just think that's fantastic.
Definitely. And it's really funny to imagine gang wars between followers of Jesus and followers of Cybele in ancient
Yeah.
times.
Absolutely.
But I think especially because I feel like transgender issues have taken such a big part of the public conversation as of late. I think it must be comforting to know that like we haven't really changed all that much in all this time that has passed. I mean, from the very beginning, there's been transgender people, and you see that also with like the Spartans in ancient Greece. I don't even think they really categorize people as being gay or heterosexual. It's just kind of that's the way things were, and so it's interesting that so much later in time we're so much more conservative about things because I think a lot of people tend to think of history as getting more and more liberal as time goes on, but that's really not the case.
You're absolutely right, and none of this is new. As you mentioned in Sparta and other times and places, of course there have always been gay people. Although, now we have these kind of labels, like you might think of somebody as heterosexual or bisexual or homosexual, whatever. People were just kind of sexual. You wouldn't always like assign these labels to people, especially in the ancient world. A lot of people probably would have been considered pansexual today, and it was completely normal. So, like, sex wasn't necessarily what you want so much as like what you do. It's more like an action rather than an identity. And of course, throughout time, like there has been kind of pushback against that, and homophobia has always been a thing, but it doesn't mean that this wasn't happening.
That's interesting, thinking of it as an action and not an identity. I don't think I've ever
Hmm.
heard it phrased that way before, but I think it's a pretty interesting way to look at it. So I guess obviously you're a historian, but I think yeah, I think it's fair to say you specialize in doing research on topics like sex. I'm curious how has history informed your view of sex, or how has sex informed your view of history?
Well, that's a really good question. I guess sex is really what got me interested in history in the first place. And looking at the history of sex, I mean, it kind of makes me despair about like the sort of modern world, I guess. You look at all these other times, people have always had their hangups, but in some ways, like views of sex in the past were healthier in certain respects than they are now. Now everything is very much like you have this very long life and there's a lot of pressure on you to have this very nuclear family. And in America, a lot of, kind of male female relationships are, I mean, very toxic, to be honest with you.
Hmm.
And there's this kind of incredible pressure on people to just be with one person from a very early age. And there's a lot of good in that, but there's a lot of bad in it as well. I feel like modern society, particularly in America, is putting a lot of pressure on people to conform to this kind of ideal that people have never really been able to hold up in the past. Like they like to say, oh, well, all relationships have always been like this, but they weren't. In years gone by, I mean, it was very common for people to have affairs. It wasn't necessarily a big deal. People did experiment before marriage, and they didn't always get married super young. For example, in the 17th century, where I write a lot of my books, most kind of common people didn't actually get married until their late 20s or even early 30s. And the view on that is, people like to assume that people got married when they were 13 and worked and died when they were 20, but that's just not the case. People of the past were a lot more similar to people now.
Taking a quick break to talk about one of the lessons that I learned from a mentor of mine, Tim Ferriss. Now, to be clear, I've actually never met him, but one of the perks of technology is that you can have mentors that you've never met before. The internet is an ocean of resources for tools that can help you improve any aspect of your life. But today, I want to focus on a couple of things that I learned from Tim Ferriss that have greatly impacted mine. So, one of the things I learned from Tim Ferriss, and he talks about this a lot, is quality of life in the present tense. He believes that designing a life that you want comes with a lot of testing. So there's a sense of hesitation that many of us may have when it comes to making big decisions, especially if they threaten any sense of comfort that you're currently experiencing. At the same time, if you look at your life in chapters, you may be surprised to find out that many of the most difficult obstacles you overcome, many of the situations that have afforded you the most growth, were not easy decisions to make. So this is something that really helped me. Treat everything like an experiment. And the word experiment here is very key. You have to experiment. Imagine if you worked your entire life in order to save up and buy a house in Costa Rica and go surfing all day, only to find out post-retirement that you don't like surfing and you don't like living in Costa Rica. That would be a bad situation, right? It's also not just regret insurance, but by limiting the scope of a big decision to an experiment, it makes the change easier to deal with. This could be moving to a different place, changing jobs, or even industries. It could be entering a new relationship, whatever. Having this kind of mindset not only prevents you from wasting time, but also prevents you from seeing things as a waste of time. So, you finally got that job that you expected to like, but you don't, and you're realizing this after 2 years? Who cares? That was an experiment. Now, you've not only tested those waters and acquired new skills, but now you can start another experiment where you bring yourself closer to the life that you want to have. Try to see things as an experiment. It'll make those big decisions seem smaller, and failures can sometimes seem like wins. All right, back to the show. When we look at the past, I feel like we do have this obsession of judgment in a historical context. We go back and we judge whatever period that we're looking at. We take our standards of morality and we apply it to back then, and we say, how could these people do this? How can these people live like this? I'm really curious to maybe hear your take on that and what your perspective is about judging the people of the past in a modern context.
Well, I do think it's important to keep in mind that, of course, times change, but I really
Mm-hmm.
don't think that people do. You know, I mean, rape is objectionable anytime it happens. Like the fact that it wasn't
Sure.
necessarily punished in the past or that women would be blamed for it. I mean, that much hasn't really changed, although, people are kind of speaking out about it more, for example. But in the past, it didn't mean that it was okay. And it didn't mean that it didn't bother the people that it happened to. It would still be a horrible thing to go through. So I think it's important to, keep in mind, like when you're looking into the past, okay, let's consider these laws, but also really try to put yourself in their shoes. How would that have felt for these people? Like if something like that happens to you and you suffer and you're judged and you can't get any justice for it. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people today can really relate to that, sadly. So, I mean, that's a terrible example, but there are a lot of other things like that as well. So you can keep in mind, kind of laws or traditions or, things that are very common on a day-to-day kind of basis. But just bear in mind always when you're looking into history, whether you're doing it professionally or you're just doing it for fun, people are always people. And at their
Mm-hmm.
core, people don't really change.
I like that. People are always people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a tendency in people to naturally try to justify things that they can't explain. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're born into a situation where slavery exists, something terrible like that, you know, you almost try to find excuses for it. Why is it like this? How did this happen? Or today, you think about all the people who drive past the homeless people on the side of the road,
Mm-hmm.
people try to say like, oh, well, they brought this on themselves, or this could never happen to me. And, of course it could. It could happen to anybody, unfortunately. But people, if they find injustice like that, if something is objectionable enough, they're always going to bend over backwards to try to explain it. They try to make sense of it. And I think that's a very human tendency, but it doesn't mean that you can always do that. There are some things you just can't make sense of.
Totally. One of the things that, when in listening to Dirty Sexy History, one of the things that really stands out to me, I think you have two strengths. One of them being, I think it's really cool to learn about history in the form of, like, it's not all about the aristocracy. It's not all about the presidents or the kings or the queens. It's about the regular people and how they lived, which I love. But also, I think that you do a good job at bringing life to these characters, especially these ones that are even larger than life on the page. So, like, I'll give you an example. I knew who Rasputin was. You did a podcast on him. I knew who he was. I knew he was just kind of like this Russian mystic who was like, it was invincible. He survived like a bunch of assassination attempts. And then I listened to your podcast, and then I went and I watched the new Kingsman movie. I'm not sure if you know this, but he's in it. Do you know
Oh, I
that?
haven't seen it yet.
Okay, yeah. Well, yeah. So it takes place in Russia, and he's in it. And so when he came on screen, I was like, "Oh, that's my guy. That's Rasputin." And nobody
Yeah.
understood what I was talking about or why I was so excited. But I think part of that is because I had this idea of who he was from your podcast, and when I saw him on screen, I was like, "Oh, this is so much fun for me."
Oh, that's so great. I'm so glad to hear it. I find him so interesting. Although when I try to explain kind of what I found out about him, people don't believe me because people they have this really awful idea of him in their heads. And a lot of it does actually come from propaganda that came out around the time that he was alive. It was just so relentless that people still believe it today. And then of course in with that animated movie Anastasia, he was like green or something. Anyway,
Yeah.
like there's a lot of hate that goes to Rasputin, and like whatever you think I mean, like the history is a lot more interesting than that. And in that episode, I kind of covered his well, appropriately enough, his views on sex.
Hmm.
And that's really interesting because, of course, I was trying to initially answer the question, was Rasputin truly Russia's greatest love machine, as Boney M suggested back in the 70s? It started as kind of a joke, and then I really got into it, and I found it quite inspiring, actually.
Yeah. That's funny. Russia's greatest love machine. That'd be quite the reputation to have throughout history. And I think
Oh,
it
no
happens a
pressure.
lot.
Yeah. I think it does.
Yeah, and that happens a lot throughout history too, where people are propagandized so much that we just kind of accept these narratives as truth. I think that happened with Caligula too, right? Where like we call him Caligula, but the reality is it meant like little boots, and he would have hated that name. He's like this really powerful Roman emperor who was
Yeah.
crazy, but then like we don't even know how crazy he was because we don't even have his name right.
Oh, it's nuts. Oh my gosh, there's so much of that in ancient Rome. Really crazy stories.
Yeah, one of my favorite time periods. But I'm curious. I have to ask, who? I mean, you do so much research, and the research you do is always focused on like the most crazy people in history. I'm curious, who is the most outrageous character you've encountered, or who was just somebody that you read about that really stuck out to you and resonated with you?
Oh, goodness. I think I'd have to say Lola Montez. Now, this is one we just did an episode on her last week, and it's actually the first of two parts. She had the most incredible life. Now, Lola Montez was one of those famous 19th century courtesans, right? She's a
Mm.
famous dancer. Although now people write a lot of histories about like royal mistresses and things like that. And she was a royal mistress. She was the mistress to King Ludwig the First of Bavaria. But that wasn't the only thing she did. She had an absolutely wild life. So, she was born in India. She had this terrible marriage at a very young age. The guy left her. She became a dancer. She traveled all over Europe and Russia. She was welcomed into all of these royal courts, and she had affairs with all these incredibly famous people.
Mm.
And then in Bavaria, things kind of blew up. She had too much political influence. She was forced to leave, and she ended up in America. So she made it all the way to California. They named a mountain after her. She had a pet bear. She did another terrible, doomed world tour, and she ultimately died in Brooklyn. I mean, this life is incredible. And I've been researching it for months, and there's still so much stuff that we have to leave out. But really, really interesting character, very inspiring. She's one of those women that history say never existed. She was completely self-possessed. She did whatever she wanted. She made her own decisions. She was a chain smoker. She had all these boyfriends. She was just a complete badass. And people think that women like that just never happened. And of course they did.
This episode was sponsored by reaching out to someone you haven't spoken to in a while. We all have that one person that has somehow slipped our mind for a bit. Life gets busy, it's okay. But how nice is it to get one of those random texts from someone who just wants to know how you're doing? Well, here's your chance to do that for someone else. I encourage you to take a moment, send someone a text, give them a phone call, tell them that you love them, that you're thinking about them, and I'm sure they'll appreciate it. So, a big focus on this podcast is really discussing things that we normally don't. So I just kind of wanted to open up to you. You mentioned earlier that you had this brain aneurysm that kind of changed the way that you looked at the world, and kind of for at least a time, and I'm not sure if you still feel this way, but you felt like you every day had the potential to be your last day, and that affected the way you approached writing and approached life in general. What were some of the perspectives that you still carry with you about that? And I was hoping maybe you could just expand on what you've learned from the experience.
Yeah, sure, I'll do my best. The best way I could describe it is almost this kind of perpetual state of like mindfulness.
Mm.
So, if you feel like you're in danger, like your senses become very sharp and you become very aware of them. Now, fortunately, they say I'm in the clear, I'm not in danger anymore, but like that does always kind of stick with you if it becomes a habit. So you start to think like that every day. And one thing I will say is that it makes you an excellent writer because you're very aware of everything going on at
Mm-hmm.
all times. Not that I'd recommend it to anybody, but you can do that, through meditation and things like that too.
Mm-hmm.
So you become aware of that and you become acutely aware of what's actually important. So you have a lot less patience with like, oh, well, what does society think I should do? And what does my dad think I should do? And what do my friends think of me? You don't care.
Mm-hmm.
Like you think about like what's important to you. Like if you died tomorrow, what do you want to accomplish? Do you want to write something? Do you want to go somewhere? Do you just really want some ice cream? I don't know. Whatever it is, whatever is like important to you. You think about your own values and you realize there's just no time to waste. And that was something that I was hoping that people would start to get, I guess, around this pandemic. And the whole pandemic has been, I mean, obviously it's been really terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say that anything good could come out of it, but it is interesting to look at how people's thinking starts to shift. And what surprised me so much is how in denial everybody is. Although I mean, I guess it is one of the stages of grief, so it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, pandemic aside, I think all of it just really got me thinking about what do I want to do? What are my values? You don't want to, well, I don't know, some people probably do, but I mean for me it was like I don't want to exist as just like one extra part of this society and fulfill what people expect of me. Like you don't accept the status quo as easily.
Mm-hmm.
There's this kind of script for everybody's life, like in America. Like they tell you, you're meant to be, kind of
Mm-hmm.
hardworking and straight and all this stuff, and you're supposed to get married really young and then have kids and have a certain kind of job and never quit and never do anything different. And you're supposed to have holidays on certain days and you're supposed to wear a certain thing. But you really start to question it, like why? Why do I need to do that? I don't want to do any of that. Maybe I want to write. Maybe I want to go to Europe. Maybe I want to be nocturnal for 2 years. I don't know. So you can start to really think about what is important to you. And hopefully it's not too much the opinions of other people. And to a point maybe it is, but your opinion of yourself is always going to be more important. It's more important for you to do what you're really passionate about. And you might lose some people, like you might lose some friends. Some people might not understand your choices, but what's great is that if you're doing what is important to you and what you really want to do and you're living your truth, for lack of a better term, you will start to attract the people who are also doing that and the people who see that and respect it and think it's great. So you might have certain friends kind of fall away, but then you might stumble into kind of a found family that's much better than anything that you could have anticipated. And I really recommend that. I mean, if I had stayed in Minnesota and, kind of did what society told me to do, I mean, oh my God, I can't imagine where I'd be in my life right now. Like you're not supposed to go to Europe for school and you're not supposed to write romance novels and all this stuff, because of course, society really also kind of looks down on romance novels to a point. But, fortunately, my mom was very, very supportive and my grandma as well. And, they always told me like, you got to do it. And people still kind of criticize some of my choices. I mean, like, I'm 36 and I do write this stuff, I do sell books about sex. It's my whole thing, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't have kids. I'm not planning to have kids. And a lot of people really don't understand that. But for me, that was right. That's what I wanted to do. But if I had never gone to school or never started writing and, I can't imagine what kind of life that would be. So for me, actually kind of getting that diagnosis and going like, okay, look, I have no time to waste. I have no time for this bullshit. I mean, it was actually kind of a crazy blessing. Things really did work out for the best.
That was so well said. And I was talking to in one of the episodes I did with Jill Ringer. She survived cancer twice, and but
Wow.
it was really intense the second time that she had it, and it's she described very similar feelings that you described of really understanding what you want and your opinion of yourself being the most important, and having any type of experience where you're actually confronted with death, I think really brings things into scope
I
because
agree.
you understand how much of the things that you care about are actually just bullshit, right? One thing I liked that you said a lot was your opinion of yourself is most important, because I think oftentimes we make so many decisions based on what other people think is best for us, and when you're not following your own compass, you end up being more unhappy than you would be if you did. At least that's what I've found.
I completely agree. Yeah. And
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, history actually feeds into that a little bit for me. So as I've been looking into, the history of sex and things like that, you start to see where some of these hangups kind of come from. And one thing I thought was particularly revealing, I mean, you have the history of how, the church's view on sex has changed over the years. And in recent years, and when I say recent, I'm talking about the last 200 years.
Yeah, church's been around
Now
for a while.
it's been a while. Yeah, it's been around for a while. So in the last kind of 200 years, as these, kind of racial tensions started to come around, basically they completely changed their stance on things like contraception and abortion, basically because they were afraid of getting outnumbered by other races.
Mm,
And that's really what it comes down to. And for me, that's just disgusting. But now,
of
you
course.
have people saying like, oh my gosh, well, that's bad, or all contraception is bad and abortion is always bad. But if you know where it comes from, you can actually kind of stop for a minute and say, wait a minute, but what do I think? Not necessarily like, well, the church is telling me this for my own good or for my soul or for whatever. Like it actually comes down to a couple of racist people in the 19th century, saying what's what. And I think it's healthy to question that.
I feel like you're a type of person that is constantly asking themselves, like, what do I think about this? Because I think it's so easy, because there's so many ideologies that you could subscribe to. Like, you can be left, you can be on the right, you can be any form of religion, and then you can identify with your job. Like, you can be feminist or misogynist. I don't know. There's just so many different labels that you could put on yourself, and when you do
Yes.
that, I find that you tend to lean into whatever the narrative of that ideology is. But if you are consistently asking yourself, like, what do I actually think about this? I think not only does it help you live in a way that's not as easily manipulated, but you actually get a better understanding of who you are as a person.
Yeah, and I think it's healthy to question these things. I mean, obviously, kind of all media is biased and, the politics right now are a mess
Mm-hmm.
anyway. But I think it's always healthy to, like actually, do research, but like also, like you can take some time and really think things through. And I always try to approach everything. I mean, whether it's like politics or history or anything, I try to approach it from a point of empathy. I
Mm-hmm.
really do worry about like, what are other people going through? It's not just kind of like being better than other people or whatever. Like, I want everyone to do well and I want everyone to feel included and happy.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I mean, that really leads into, well, of course, like being a feminist, but also, being very supportive of, like any kind of civil rights,
Mm-hmm.
or gay marriage or the rights of transgender people to use the appropriate bathroom. I mean, like so many people do kind of, accept this line. I really would encourage people, don't just accept like, okay, well, this person's angry, so they must be right. Just sit down for a minute, try to look at things from another point of view, have empathy for other people, and think about what you actually think. You know,
Mm-hmm.
are they hurting anyone? No. Sit down, shut up. You know what I mean? Anyway, I mean, that's how I feel.
No, I totally get it. I totally get what you mean, and it feeds into something that I was hoping we can get to, which was, I think you did an episode on the storming of the Bastille, and you opened it
Yes.
up, getting kind of political. I didn't feel like you were saying anything that was too outrageous or anything that would really be divisive. But you mentioned that you're gonna get political, but that everything is political. That's something that I struggle with this podcast too. Is like, I'm talking about the existentialism, all the problems that come with existing. A lot of those things are political, but it's like oftentimes the nature of reality is amoral. Like, the world is indifferent to you, and then you have to kind of grapple with morality in a world that is indifferent to morality. So I'm just kind of curious what you meant by saying that everything is political and that it's impossible not to be.
Well, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I started talking about that, it was actually it was kind of a response because somebody had criticized the podcast before that and said that we were too political,
Hmm.
and I just thought that was such a ridiculous thing to say. um, I mean, it's fine, no shame, whatever. Everybody has different tastes, but
Hmm.
basically, everything is political, okay? Like politics, they're not about minor administrative points anymore. Like everything is personal. And as they
Hmm.
say, the personal is political. So,
Hmm.
when you have one side arguing that, like women shouldn't be able to control their own bodies, or it should be more difficult for Black people to vote, I mean, your identity, your gender, your sexuality, your race, I mean, it becomes a political issue. Like it isn't like, should we build this bridge anymore? It's more like, who do you consider people? And I mean, like, I guess I'm outrageous because I consider everybody to be people. But like when when you
Yeah.
make politics about these issues, and when your political stance is trying to cut back on the civil rights of another person or another group of people, I mean, that's a problem. So if you are able to kind of remove yourself from that and then like say, okay, well, I'm not going to think about identity issues. I'm going to just vote. I don't know. I'm going to vote for one side because I like their economic policy or whatever.
Hmm.
Then congratulations. It doesn't affect you. I have no idea what that's like, you know?
Hmm.
So, I mean, this really feeds into dirty, sexy history as well. So when when politics touch on all of these different identity issues, history becomes political as well. And, they do consistently use history to try to justify rolling back people's rights. So history is inherently political, whether you're covering the history of politics or not. But if you are a person, I mean, politics should be of interest to you.
I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this because so I used to be like very much political, like, and I just felt like I was very much involved. But one thing that I've learned in the pandemic is that I just felt like I was getting worn out because I just like was too involved in politics and I felt like it wasn't good for my mental health, and so I scaled it back. And it's helped me a
Mm.
lot. And maybe that's a luxury for me because a lot of the things politically I'm not affected by. But I felt like limiting the amount of hills that I was willing to die on was actually really positive for my mental health.
I do actually think that's healthy. I mean, I think it's important to be aware of these things and to do what you can to affect positive change. But burnout is a thing.
Hmm.
If you need to look after yourself, you need to unplug, you need to delete your Twitter for a while, more power to you. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we can't be like tilting at windmills 24/7. It's okay.
Yeah. And Hassan Minhaj, he's a comedian. He did a bit about this on one of his shows where he was just like, you don't need to care about everything, but just like care about something. And then he closed it out by being like, plastic
Yeah.
straws. I hate paper straws. That's on you. Like I'm getting plastic straws. I thought it was kind of
Right, yeah. No, I think that's perfectly reasonable. And everybody has different strengths, I mean, I can go to marches and I do,
funny.
but for me it's actually I think it's more effective for me to just kind of do what I'm good at. And for me, I mean, that's always been this history, it's a history of sex and gender and contraception and all that good stuff. If I can do that effectively and I can make people feel like they're not alone or make people feel like there's nothing wrong with them. I mean, to me it feels like that's like my service. Like that's what I want to do. If it helps anybody, I think I've won.
Totally, and that's a noble ambition, and that's it's like a large part of why I started this podcast, right? Because it was like I don't really know much about much, but I do know about what it's like to feel anxious and depressed. So I guess I'll just do a
Yeah.
podcast about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, and I think like you probably relate to this. Like for me, it was like I didn't really know what to do about it because I'm not like I had a bad experience with therapy, and then I didn't like antidepressants, so I stopped taking them. I was like, oh man, well those are the two things that I thought were going to really help, and they didn't, and so I was kind of at a loss. And then I just started reading a ton. I started reading mostly philosophy, and I felt like the practical applications of it, one of them you touched on being mindfulness, like being able to like take all those and really focus on internalizing them was something that helped me. So like I know that most people aren't going to go and want to read some of the books that we read, but if we can take that, dilute it down to something that is understandable, even if it's just one sentence that'll help somebody, I think that's worth putting in the effort.
And maybe that's our superpower. And you're having these difficult conversations and you're getting people to open up. And I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate you you opening up here in this podcast with me. And you said something earlier that I really liked, which was when you decide to go down your own path, you do risk losing people, but that in going down your own path, you're going to gain other people that are going to be more in line to the direction that you want to go in life. And I like that a lot. I think it's a really cool sentiment, because I think oftentimes people are afraid to make major changes in their life because of the loss that naturally comes with it, but then they don't see all the potential gains as well. And one of those gains is talking to you.
Oh,
I was like, I was like, should I start this thing? And I decided to start it, and now look, I get to have these great conversations with you. So, yeah, it's a really cool idea, and I'm glad that I was able to hear that from you, because I'm definitely something I'm going to be thinking about in the next several years, probably.
well, absolutely. You're living it. You're doing it now. You've already done the hard part. You got started. That's terrific.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to see, what direction that you go as well. So I was just curious to hear from you. What is something that bothers you about the world we live in today? And then what is something that you see as a potential solution to it? I know that we've covered a lot so far, but I was curious if there's anything else that you'd like to include or chat about.
Oh yeah, no, this actually touches on a couple of things that we've already talked about. I
Mm-hmm.
guess the one thing that does bother me, and I don't know if I should have been surprised, but I do like to think the best of people. The pandemic's really brought it out as well, is just how selfish people are. There's this mentality, especially in this country. It's very much like it's not enough for you to be doing well or for you to have enough in your own life, but you have to be doing better than other people. And I don't really understand that. I mean, I want everybody to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Totally.
it's all about coming from a place of empathy. And I think, learning about other people and, talking to people and reading these stories, whether it's, today or whether it's history, just being able to consider what it would be like to live a different life. I mean, I think that's important. But on a bigger level, I do think that there's a lot of positive change that we need to make. For example, I think single payer healthcare or something like Medicare for all would be ideal. I think it
Mm-hmm.
would solve a lot of problems. Things like people having living wages and these different kind of social safety nets that have been rolled back over the years. Making sure that people have access to clean water. I mean, really, really basic stuff like that. The kind of things that people need just to survive. I don't understand, I guess, why people think it's okay to put that pressure on other people to kind of obtain those things for themselves. For example, these people, like you mentioned, people trying to, survive cancer twice. I mean, that's terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Like having to go through that, it would be just an absolutely challenging and devastating time. Like you shouldn't be worried about how you're going to pay for it. And
Absolutely.
this is something that happens a lot. People have to worry about that. Just a couple months back, I actually ended up in the hospital really briefly with a heart thing, and I was worried. I was really worried about the bill, and it was scary. And this is something that people have to deal with, and they shouldn't have to worry about that. You know, so for me, I mean, it is all about empathy, but maybe you are in a better position where, you have good insurance and you're not worried about that. But, one day you might not be in that position. So just the idea of kind of being less kind of self-obsessed, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to think of these ways to, enact positive change so everybody benefits. I mean, that's just something that I think about a lot. I just don't understand how other people don't think that's a good idea. I mean, that's one thing that just completely mystifies me.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially when like the healthcare stuff. I just get really frustrated when I'm on social media and I see another GoFundMe page for some type of injury or some
Oh,
type
I
of
know.
funeral. It's like, so our health system is GoFundMe and Kickstarter.
It
When
is.
something happens to somebody, it's up to everybody else to band together and take care of it. And there is an aspect of that that is beautiful for the reasons that you mentioned, where you get to see in real time people being empathetic for somebody, but at the same time, it's like it's pretty devastating. Like to live in a
Right.
system where that is the almost like the default solution.
And we shouldn't be in that position,
Right.
and a lot of other countries are managing just fine. And I used to live in the UK, and of
Mm-hmm.
course they have the NHS. And while I was there, I never had to pay a medical bill. I was in the emergency room a couple of times. Nothing ever happened. Like they took care of me and I went home. It was great.
Mm-hmm.
And taxes aren't more. I grew up with that, sort of idea that, oh, well, taxes are lower here. And then you get over there and you realize they're not. It's essentially the same. Like
Yeah.
it would
But we have the
actually,
money.
yeah, and it would actually save us money because of all of the bills that get written off all the time. So, like as a country, we would actually save money if we had single payer healthcare. And that is just the biggest, I'm sorry, can I say mind fuck?
Yeah, yeah, please.
Okay, it's
Yeah.
just the biggest mind fuck of all. It makes sound economic sense. The only reason to not do it is basically to punish people or to try to force them to stay in these jobs and not kind of, follow their dreams like I guess you and me are trying to do. Like the cruelty is the point. And
Mm.
it's disgusting. And a lot of people can't see outside of that. They want to say, "Oh, well, I worked hard and I deserve this," and they don't. Well, you don't need to be so kind of mean-spirited about it. Everybody deserves to live.
Absolutely. I preach just trying to be a fan of everybody because it's just like it's a better way to live in my opinion. Just trying to be, if someone's doing well, I'm happy for you. If
Yes.
someone's not doing well, I hope that you get better. Like I don't know. To me,
Yes, always.
there's no benefit to envy and there's no benefit to being cruel to another person because what is it that ultimately it damages yourself. Like you're just gonna
Hmm.
reap the negative aspects of that as well. So
I
I
completely agree.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm on the same page as you. Okay, so last question. You mentioned you have experience with anxiety, depression. What is something that helped you overcome it, or just made living a little bit easier?
That's a great question. And I think it's something a lot of people struggle with. Now, when I had depression really badly when I was younger, writing was what got me out of it. Although, as I'm getting older, I'm increasingly having issues with anxiety. I have pretty
Hmm.
severe anxiety at the moment. This is something that I'm actually dealing with now. And also, it goes along with ADHD as well. So a couple of things have been helping. I finally started getting treatment for my anxiety, as in I finally started a medication.
Hmm.
It only took me until I was 36 to actually give it a shot, but I am finally taking a medication for anxiety, which is helping so far. Exercise helps a lot.
Hmm.
Ideally, I like to try to exercise for an hour every day. It's my time when I get to shut off my phone. It's amazing. I love it.
Yeah.
So that really helps. And then this sounds really weird, but for my ADHD, I've just started using this this really involved like planner. And the way it works, you're supposed to like decorate it with stickers. It's a happy planner. And this is one of those things I never would have taken seriously and I thought was really silly for a long time. But then I kind of got one for Christmas and I started using it. And every time you get to give yourself a sticker for completing a task, it's like you get this little kind of like burst of joy. And like I realize that it's kind of silly, but it's actually helping. So, like, I've been on task for 3 weeks, which is shocking for me, honestly. So, I'm not going to question it too hard. If,
Congrats.
if there's something that kind of works and helps you to find that joy, I think that's great. So, uh, at the moment, I mean, I would say if you do have pretty bad anxiety, I would absolutely encourage people to talk to your doctor. If things like exercise and mindfulness and that, if it isn't enough, like there's nothing wrong with going on medication. I had such severe anxiety for such a long time without realizing it that I actually gave myself a heart condition because I was basically in fight or flight mode all the time.
Mm.
It's not very fun. But I mean, I would just say if you have anxiety, if you have something that is keeping you stressed all the time, that keeps you from sleeping, that keeps you from, functioning like you want to, I would absolutely encourage anybody, to try to talk to your doctor, try to get any kind of help, just reach out. I mean, of course, it might not be perfect immediately. You might not have access to these things, but just really do what you can because you do deserve it. You deserve to be comfortable in your own skin. You should have a life that you want to live.
Absolutely. And it's okay to not be okay. And it's
Yes,
always okay to
absolutely.
ask for help.
Please always, always, always ask for help. Now, this is something that I've never been good at myself, and it's something that I'm very much learning now. But honestly, I'm so glad I did. I mean, they're already looking up, and I mean, I wish I'd done it sooner.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that things are on the up and up for you. But Jessica, this has been such a great conversation. I mean, I was really looking forward to it ever since you said that you wanted to have it with me. So,
Great.
yeah, this has been better than I even anticipated it being, and it's really fun to be able to toss these ideas back and forth with you.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. Your questions were really good.
Cool, thank you. Well, maybe we could do this again sometime.
I'd love that. Yeah, anytime.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. If you're interested in hearing more from Jessica, check out her podcast, Dirty Sexy History. It's so good, and you get to listen more to that soothing voice of hers. On the next episode, I'm speaking to the host of the Artology podcast, Vincent Nell, where he examines movies in an attempt to find God in cinema. It's a fun one. We talk about movies, we talk about our dads, and I'm very thankful for how open Vincent was willing to be with me because this next episode is deep, so you're not going to want to miss it. If you'd like to stay in the loop for when the next episode is released, feel free to follow me on Instagram at Here's Johnny Nava, and that's my handle for pretty much every form of social media, so find me wherever you want. Until next time, I hope you have a beautiful day, a beautiful life, and I hope that you experiment in as many ways as you see fit. Until next time.